The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. International students contribute to the well-being of Australians by fuelling economic growth and prosperity that provides jobs for Australians. In 2023, international education contributed $48 billion to the Australian economy. It was responsible for more than half of the economic growth in the last financial year. And tourism related to international students living in Australia also boosts our economy by around $5 billion annually, with each international student attracting 2 or more visitors from overseas. This is significant. They also enhance Australia's multicultural fabric, bringing diverse perspectives and fostering cross-cultural understanding. International students that remain in Australia are our largest single source of skilled migrants. They help fill skill shortages in critical industries such as healthcare, engineering, IT and education. Others return to their home country to become leaders in business, politics and cultural industries with a respect and appreciation of Australian culture. So we should nurture this goodwill, not trash it. Let's call this bill out because, to me, this is a knee-jerk reaction to, I would say, the opposition's false narrative and attribution of a current housing crisis, which is a supply crisis that is not due but to international students and their impact on migration. Rather, it is, but unfortunately the government, rather than standing up for this important industry, I'm concerned that this legislation is going to damage a very, very important economic driver of the Australian economy. This is a very important industry, and the government is, through this, I think, looking at driving down immigration numbers because of the scare campaign from the opposition, but by hurting and capping international students, we are putting at risk our international reputation and a major economic driver. International students only make up 4% of Australia's rental market. So to attribute our housing supply crisis to them is simply a false narrative. There are far greater long-term structural issues in Australia's housing market that are the causes of problems we face, that we face currently. Only that would explain how I'd say now we have such a far-reaching bill so quickly, and there are so many concerns around the broad powers that are being provided to the minister. So for me, and by many, this bill has been described as a recipe for chaos that at worst will risk the closure of certain programs and universities if it's not managed properly. But mostly it will absolutely damage our international reputation, and it will send a signal to those markets that Australia is not where they want to come and study, that they are not welcome. So that is incredibly concerning. It is unclear how the government will be using some of the ministerial powers and the level of intervention that will be possible, and I am concerned that this is quite unprecedented. Now, I have had discussions with the minister, and he assures me, and I will get into more detail in relation to amendments and discussions that I've had. But nonetheless, legislation should be robust and should not facilitate overt intervention by government and minister, especially in a sector like education. So international students and migrants who come to Australia are a huge part of the Australian success story. Welcoming international students to Australia is a proud part of our education history and legacy. If we look back, the Colombo Plan is best remembered for sponsoring thousands of Asian students to study and train in Australian tertiary institutions for several decades and playing a key part of building links with key partners in Asia. The former coalition government resurrected it as a new Colombo Plan during their last term in office to encourage a two-way flow of students between Australia and the rest of our region. International students should not be simply measured by the fees they pay to study here, but the wider contribution they make to Australia while they are here, especially if they remain over the longer term. Especially also in the context where we have so many sectors with massive skill shortages and no clear pathway of how we are going to address that. So, what does the bill do? As it currently stands, and I hope there will be amendments and changes in this place or the other, There is not really a lot of detail around the scope of the proposed caps or how decisions will be made and applied to higher education institutions themselves, so the ability to assess the impact on their future operation is limited. It's causing huge angst and concern amongst institutions and for international students considering Australia as a destination. There are also additional flow-on effects for meeting Australia's current and future skills shortage and other areas like tourism and hospitality sectors. It has a huge impact on places like Warringah, where there are significant hospitality and retail businesses and staff and skill shortages. And there is a reliance on international students for those roles because they cannot be filled otherwise. The alternative is businesses that are not open or that are not open to the full capacity because they simply can't get the staff. And so I would say that there are other measures relating to regulation of student recruitment. There are provider and course registration and provision of education. There has been a number of previous reviews and inquiries into the sectors that don't appear to have really landed. Now, the government claims this bill will improve the quality, integrity and sustainable growth of the international education sector. But there are many that do doubt this. So I support the efforts to place safeguards around education providers to ensure they do provide quality education services to overseas students, and that is provided for in this bill. I do acknowledge that there have been dodgy providers and agents and that the system has been open to abuse and exploitation, and that there has been some providers and agents who have profiteered from international students, and this bill now allows for stronger action to prevent that, to prevent unscrupulous business practices in the industry going forward. However, the bill also gives the Minister for Education far-reaching powers that, if exercised, could negatively affect our largest services export market, which is international education. To be clear for those watching, the bill will empower the Minister to pause the registration of new providers and new courses by registered providers, limit the enrolments of overseas students by provider, course or location over a year, automatically suspend and cancel specified courses on the basis of systemic issues, their value to Australia's skills and training needs and priorities, or if it's considered to be in the public interest. Now, the difficulty with that is that's quite broad and obviously can be open to politicisation as well. So it's a very high-stakes roadmap and that we need to really consider. So some of the risks to the Australian economy that I see from this legislation and why I urge the government to really proactively engage with amendments in this place or the other. So we know it is our largest services export market and a huge driver of economic growth. Many international students study courses where Australia faces skill shortages and can have the potential to fill critical gaps in the workforce after graduation. Around 30% of international students transition to work visas after graduating. During their studies, they also work, as I've said, in hospitality, retail, tourism and service sectors. Overall, 240,000 full-time jobs are supported by international students in the wider economy. By placing often arbitrary caps on student numbers, taking particular courses or attending particular institutions, we are telling international students that they are not free to choose what they want to study and, in some cases, where, and in some cases not welcome at all. The group of 8 universities have calculated that if they are capped to a pre-COVID 2019 level of international students, then conservatively benchmarking against 2023 figures, it would have a potential immediate impact of some $5.35 billion and over 22,500 jobs to the economy. There's also the political risk to the government of making certain allocations of caps to certain institutions rather than now allowing market-based forces to determine student numbers. The requirement that the courses offered meet Australian skills and training needs also makes little sense when 70 to 80% of students return home after their studies. So you're saying come and study what we care about, even if you're going back to your home country, about what your studies were going to be required. So most need to study courses to meet the skill shortages in their own countries, not in Australia. Ultimately, Australia is participating in an ever-increasingly competitive export industry. International students are spoilt for choice around the world. This bill puts the reputation of Australian education system at risk. So I do call on the government to take the necessary time to take a more nuanced and considered approach to what this bill is proposing. It's clearly unsatisfactory and leaves many with doubts and anxiety and too many questions unanswered. I note, for example, amendments by myself and members of the crossbench to delay commencement for further consideration are at the moment being rebuffed on the basis that it's a commitment by the government, and interestingly, it appears to be more home affairs and migration that is driving this rather than actually the education sector, and which says this is a political positioning, not a best interest merit-based positioning. The feedback in my electorate is the bill is too broad in its current form, and far-reaching ministerial discretion is placing caps and restrictions, and that could have devastating implications. Education providers, even Warringah alone, have completely different situations. Some have spare accommodation available now, some have student numbers that have not returned to pre-COVID levels, so caps won't make sense. Of course, we also have a high credibility and quality rating have seen increased visa rejections recently with no reasonable explanations provided. So applying uniform restrictions and caps to one specialty course provider in a less densely populated area compared to a university in a metropolitan Sydney where rental properties are largely inaccessible or a private English school is not practical. It's illogical to impose a singular formula for student number caps across such diverse institutions. Moreover, the requirement for additional accommodation to be provided before permitting higher student numbers makes will be difficult in many cases. I am deeply concerned about giving one federal minister so much overarching power over our education system and the direction it takes. But if the government insists the bill must go ahead, then there are amendments that absolutely improve this bill. And I would urge the government not to rush this for political expediency, but to make sure you put in a system that is actually robust and in the best interest of Australia and this important market. Education providers are concerned at the time in which this has been put in and given to take effect with, for example, the implementation from 1 January 2025 is unreasonable, given that those placements would have already been offered and determined, and the plans have already been set for budgets for 2025 in all institutions. It's quite mind-boggling to think the government is insisting that this would have a commencement of 1 January 2025. When the previous outrage of the government raised in discussing tertiary education, we have to raise the issue of HECS fees, and in particular the actions of the previous government in raising the fees when it came to arts degrees. Again, it's that example of reaching into a sector and deciding, picking favourites of which sectors should be prioritised for study over others. For what that's meant is that for thousands of students, arts degrees, humanities, the cost has significantly gone up. It hasn't changed what students are wanting to study. They study what suits their needs, what suits their interest, and what they engage with. But what it's meant is a whole cohort is saddled with a huge amount of debt. An arts or similar degree brings essential skills to the workplace, to our society and to our humanity. It nurtures the ability to see different points of view, to research them and to articulate them. These complement STEM skills in positive ways and that have been extensively researched and documented. Every day you can see that degrees in laws, economics and arts are of value. As we know, of course, STEM is also of value, but they work together. And it was really worrying that the previous government really decided to penalise humanities subjects from a cost perspective. There was great hope that the change of government would mean a reversal of those consequences, but that has not happened. And so the message loud and clear from students and the sector is the government needs to address that disparity of skills. And of course that's without even talking about the changes that are required to the HECS system to ensure it is not unfairly burdening students with a system that simply doesn't make sense of how someone can be repaying their debt but not being given credit in real time by the taxation office for that repayment. So it is essential for the government to, I think, be a lot more focused on the long-term benefit of this legislation.